Let's talk about components. In UI design, these are regular elements, like, for example, buttons or forms that are reused throughout the design process. And the reasons for that are very simple: speed and efficiency. With a component, you don't need to recreate an element every time you want to use it. You simply grab it from the library, place it in your design, and you're good to go. The thing that makes components super powerful is the fact that any change you make to the main component is then passed down to all of its copies automatically. So for example, if you have the same button that you use in multiple places and you want to change its color, you do it just on the main button. All the other copies will be updated automatically. This saves a lot of time and makes maintenance a lot easier. Now, the concept of components is implemented in pretty much every mainstream design app out there. Sketch has it, Figma has it, XD has it, even though they're named differently. In Figma and XD, they're called components, but in Sketch, they're called symbols. Regardless of the name, they do exactly the same thing. And this is what we'll be discussing in this course. But hey, if we're just meeting, my name is Adi. I'm a professional web designer and developer. And in this course, I want to show you the ins and outs of working with Figma components. And we'll start by learning how to actually create one or more components. Then we'll discuss the differences between a main component and an instance or a copy of that. The following lesson is about making changes, right? So what can and cannot be modified in a component or an instance, and what happens when you do make those changes. Next, we'll talk about instance swapping. So how to do it, what are the benefits, and we'll also talk about component nesting. Then we'll briefly discuss about naming and organizing and how giving a component the right name can be very helpful. The following lesson will be about component variants, right? So we'll see what they are, how we can use them, and why they are so powerful. Next, we'll be working with component properties, which are super cool. These are relatively new, but they take this feature of components to the next level. And finally, we'll talk about or briefly discuss interactive components, which allow you to use components in a more, let's say, interactive way in Figma prototypes. So we have quite a few things to cover, but I'll do my best to explain everything in as much detail as possible so you can follow along, even if you're not very experienced with Figma. Now, speaking of Figma, did you know that there is a place where you can get over 20,000 UI kits and website templates built for Figma? And that place is called Envato Elements. It's really easy to get started. Go to elements.envato.com, go to graphic templates, choose websites or UI kits, then scroll down and choose Figma. Pick the template you want and you're done. All the assets have simple commercial licensing and you're not bound to any contract, so you can cancel whenever you want. And Elements is chock full of other goodies as well. Video templates, music and sound effects, icons, illustrations, and much, much more. So if you're interested, check out the link in the video description. Now, let's get the show on the road and learn about creating one or more components in Figma. Before we get started, you should know that the Figma file I'll be working on is available for download. Just check out the links in the video description. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to Envato Tuts Plus for more free courses and tutorials just like this one. All right, let's create some components. In Figma, you can create a component out of any selection of objects or layers. And to create a component, you first need to select the layers you'd like to include. So for example, I can select this text layer and I can create a component out of it. Or I can select this button, which is a group of elements, or in this case, it's a frame, and I can create a component out of that. Now, to actually create one, you have a couple of options. First, with the desired elements selected, you can go into the toolbar and you can click the Create Component button. Alternatively, on Windows, you can press Ctrl-Alt-K, or on Mac, Command-Option-K. You also have a different option. You can right-click your selection and you can choose Create Component. Whatever the method, the result is exactly the same. So click, and Figma now creates a component. Notice the selection boundaries here are turning a different color. They are now purple. The icon in the layers panel is also changed. You have a full diamond. And also the name of the layer is also changed. The color of the layer name is changed to match the purple of the selection here. So now you have a component created. And with it, you can, for example, copy it, Control-C, and you can go into a different page and you can paste it here. So for example, I have this layout and I can use that to paste in my new components. I'm going to update the text. And now you'll see that any change that I make on my master component, and we'll talk about master versus instance in a future lesson, but let's say I'm going to change the color of the text on my main component, right? I want to make it something darker like this. Yeah, as soon as I do that, the color on the copy of the component changes automatically, which is really, really cool. We'll explore this behavior in more detail as we're progressing through the course. But yeah, that's how you create a component. Now, depending on the number of items in your selection, you also have the ability to create multiple components. So let's say, for example, that you want to create a different style of button here, right? So you can right-click, you can detach the instance. This will basically unlink it from the component we just created. Now it's just a normal group of elements, right? And let's say you want to change the way it looks. You want to swap out the colors and make it white on blue. So you want to create a component out of this. But also, let's say you want to select this text and create a component out of that. Well, if you select both of them and you go to the toolbar, notice we now have a drop down because our selection contains more than one element. And in the drop down, you have three options. The first one will create a component that has both of these elements inside. But the second option will actually create multiple components. So it's going to create one for the green text and one for the button. Okay, so let's choose create multiple components. So now we have two new components created for us. And now, of course, I can duplicate this. I can drag it into another page. I can change its text. I can do whatever I want. Now, just a quick notice here. This copy of the component has a different icon in the layer panel. As you can see here, it's an empty diamond compared to the full diamond that you see on the first component that we created. So just keep that in mind for now. Okay, so let's take a look at a few key points to remember from this lesson. You can create a component out of any selection of objects or layers. To create a component, first select the layers you'd like to include. Then either click the Create Component button in the toolbar or right-click on your selection and choose Create Component. Alternatively, use the keyboard shortcuts Command-Option-K on a Mac or Control-Alt-K on Windows. When your selection contains more than one element, you have the option to create multiple components at the same time. Right then, that's how you create one or more components in Figma. And as you saw, when you make a copy of a component, that copy is a little bit different. So let's talk more about that in the next lesson. So, main components versus instances. What's the difference between these two? Well, it's quite simple, actually. The first time you create a component, that's the main one. Any other copy of that main component is called an instance. So let's explore these differences in more detail, and let's also see the different ways of creating an actual instance of a component. We'll actually first start here by creating a component out of this button, right? So now I have a main component with the name of button. And to create an instance, we can simply copy it. So Command-C or right-click and copy, or Control-C, of course, if you're on Windows. And let's go in here, and I'm going to paste it right under this text, right? So now we have the main and the instance. So copy, or you can also duplicate with Command or Control-D, that's going to create an instance. And you can also copy or duplicate an actual instance of a component to create another instance. Another way to create an instance of a component is by using the Assets panel that you see right here in the top left. So you open that up, and you open up the page that houses your component. And in my case, it's called button. And I can simply click and drag from here, and I can drag it wherever I want. And this will, of course, create an instance. And the third way to create an instance is by using Quick Insert, or as it's also called, the Resources modal. So you can find that right here in the toolbar, or you can press the keyboard shortcut Shift-I to open up this window, and then you will just navigate until you find the component you want, drag it in, and you're done. And that's how you create or insert component instances. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the differences between main components and instances. The first one that we see is actually the icon in the layers panel. So on the main component, we have a full diamond. It's this one right here. And on an instance, we have an empty diamond. The color of the layers is exactly the same as the purple, but the icon is what sets them apart. Now, a crucial change, or a crucial difference between component or main component and instance is the fact that any change you make to the main component will automatically cascade down to all of the instances. Okay, so for example, if I go into this main component and I decide, okay, I want to change the horizontal padding because it uses auto layout, right? I can do that here, and it's going to change it on both the component and the instance. If I'm going to go here, I can, of course, change this, let's say 64, but it's only going to change it on the instance, right? So it doesn't work the other way around. Any change that you make to an instance is not automatically being applied to the main component. There's a way around that. You can manually push these changes back to the main component by going or selecting the instance and going to the inspector and selecting push changes to main component, right? And as soon as you do that, whatever it is that you changed on the instance will be pushed to the main component. So that's another difference between the two. Now, a third difference is that you cannot add content to an instance, right? Or change the position of the elements, except, of course, the auto layout properties that you just saw. So, for example, let's say I want to grab this icon and add it to my button. I cannot go into the instance and paste it in, right? It doesn't work, even if I try it from the layers panel. But if I go to the main component, of course, I can add that content to my button, no problem whatsoever. The instance will be updated, and from the instance, I can, of course, remove this icon, but it doesn't actually remove it. Because if we take a look in the layers panel, the icon is still there, but it's hidden, right? Its visibility is hidden. So you cannot actually remove content from an instance, nor you can add content to an instance. You can only do that on or in the main component. And also you cannot change the position of the elements, right? I cannot take this icon and move it on the other side of the text, but I can do that very easily in the main component, right? I can change its position. So those are the key differences between main components and instances. Now let's take a look at a few key points to remember. The first time you create a component, you create the main. Any other copy of that main is called an instance. Component instances have a different icon in the layer panel. Any change made to the main component will automatically cascade down to the instances. You cannot add or remove content in an instance or change the position of the elements. Component instances can be created in 3 ways: from the Assets panel, by using Quick Insert, and by simply copying or duplicating the main component or another instance. So that's a quick look at how main components are different than instances. Now let's expand on this topic a little bit and see how we can make changes to components and instances and what exactly happens when we make those changes. That's coming up. So let's dive right in. We have this simple section here that has these 2 boxes with contact information, right? And I want to make a component out of this so I can reuse it across my design. So I'm going to select the first box, and I'll create a component, and then I'll duplicate it to create the second one. And this is here just for reference. So here are a couple of changes that you can make to an instance of a component, right? First of all, you can change the content. That's pretty obvious, right? So you can grab the content that you want and you can change that very easily. And as you can see, the instance now has a different content compared to the main. Another property you can change, and by the way, these are called component overrides, and they're basically the changes that you make to the supported properties of a single instance. So another override would be the fill and the stroke, right? So I can change the fill color to whatever I want. I can have it literally any color, and that's going to be independent from my main component. And I can change text properties as well. So if I don't want this to be bold, I can change it to maybe regular. I can do the exact same thing with the fill color of the background, right? I can change it like so. I can grab the color of the text that I want, and I can change it again, just like this, right? So now I can delete that reference image. Also, independent from the main component, right, I can change the following. I can change the border radius to whatever I want. I can add layout grids if I want to. I can change them. Of course, we don't have any layout grids on these elements, but if you have like larger components that require layouts grids, then know that you can change those on instances. You can also change the export settings. So for example, if on the main component I had an export setting of PNG 1x, the instance can have totally different export settings. I can export an SVG, and I can export a 4x PNG, for example. So notice these are now different between main component and instance. I can also change the layer names. So the column here, I can rename it to box if I want to. I can rename the text as well to content. And of course, that's going to be independent from the main component. Now, overrides can also be applied to layer and text styles, right? So for example, let's say I have this menu right here that has a bunch of different items, right? Each item has a different icon, and the text is different on one item, which is the active one. So let's actually create a layer style, or a text style, I should say, for the active text. So I'm going to click here, click the plus, and choose active menu item. So now let's select this. Let's create a component. And now let's select this text and create the inactive menu item text style. So now I'm going to duplicate that first menu item. And in its instance, I can change the text style to the inactive, right? So now the active one was, of course, using the semi-bold as the font weight, while the inactive was using the medium, right? So you can clearly see a little bit of difference there. But we can also do the same with layer styles, right? So I can create a color style, and I can call this menu active. And I can create a layer style from this one and call it menu inactive, right? So now I can go into my instance and I can select the text and I can swap this for a menu inactive. Just disregard the icon for now. We'll get to using images in just a little bit. But as you can see, between main component and instance, you can also swap text styles, and you can also swap color styles or layer styles. Instances can also be resized. So if I want this instance to be bigger than the main component, I can do that no problem with normal resizing, or I can hit K for scale, and I can resize it like so. So that's, of course, independent from the main component. And if at any point I decide, okay, I made way too many changes to this instance, I want to go back to its default state. Well, a couple of ways to do that. You can go into the toolbar and click Reset All Changes, or you can right-click and select the same thing, or you can go in the inspector, and here you have actually a few additional options. You can reset all the changes, or you can reset just the name or just the size. And of course, if you want to reset every single change, you just click that and it goes back to exactly the way the main component is. Moving on to this third example that I have here, I want to quickly mention push overrides. I talked about this previously, but I want to show it to you again because it's very important. So let's say, for example, you have this element, you create a component out of this, and you duplicate it, you create an instance, and then you change the content, right? Let's call this spending, and let's change the fill color of this to something like this, to a red. Yeah, so now we have main component and instance. Now, what if I'm using this instance and I'm playing around with, I don't know, maybe the font sizing, and I see, okay, maybe I like this font size better than what I had in the main component. Because this is just an instance, changes I make here don't get applied to the main component. But what I can do is I can select the instance, I can go into inspector, and I can select push changes to main component. So the main component will now get all the changes that were applied to the instance. And from here, you can, of course, just select the proper color. We have to change this again to the red. But that was a simple example of how to push or to apply the changes you make to an instance back to the main component. And if at any point I decide, okay, I don't want this instance to be linked to my main component, I can simply right-click and choose Detach Instance, or press Control-Alt-B. On macOS, it's probably Command Option B, or alternatively, you can go right here and select Detach Instance. So now this is like any other group. It has nothing to do with the main component anymore. I can change this to whatever I want, and that change will not be applied to this element anymore. Now, let's take a look at a few key points to remember from this lesson. Changes made to an instance are unique to that copy. The changes can be applied to the main component by selecting Push Changes to the main component. On any given instance, the following properties can be modified: text, fill and stroke, shadow and blur, layout grids, export settings, and layer names. Instances can also be resized or scaled. To reset the changes made to an instance, you can right-click it and select Reset All Changes. An instance can be unlinked from the main component by using the Detach Instance command. So as you can see, even though instances are linked to a main component, they can be edited individually to a pretty large extent. So in that regard, you have quite a bit of freedom. Now, something really cool that you can do with component instances is called instance swap. So let's have a look at that next. In Figma, instance swap is the ability to change one component instance with another. And there are quite a few situations where this can be very helpful. So let me show you a few examples. So let's say that I'm going to create a component out of this drop-down menu, and also a component out of this button. Okay. And at some point, I want to swap these around. Maybe I want the logout button here, and I want the drop-down here. Well, instead of manually switching these, let's actually create an instance. Okay, so I'm gonna actually drag the main component out here. And let's also create an instance of this logout button. So I'm gonna drag it somewhere around here. So now we have instance and instance. And to swap, I can go to the inspector. Of course, I need to select the instance, and I can go to the inspector, click the drop-down, and choose a different component instance. And I can do the same here. So now I just swapped that component instance with another. Now, this can be very handy for something like this, a menu, right? Where you have an icon and a piece of text. So first, what I need to do is select all the icons and create components out of them. So click down here or up here, sorry, in the toolbar, create multiple components. So now each icon is its own component. So I'm going to grab the overview or the grid icon, and I'm going to paste it right here, basically replace this one. Okay, so now with these two selected, I'm going to create a component. So now I have a component that has an instance inside and a piece of text. Then I'm going to select the component and duplicate it as many times as I want. And I can, of course, go in, change the text. I can also change the fill color and the text properties. And then on each instance, I can select the icon instance, and I can go in here and I can choose a different icon. Same goes for this, transactions. I need to select the icon instance, go in here, and where it says swap instance, I can find the icon that I want and swap it, just like that. And I can do the same for the rest. This is for messages. Find the icon, change the text, change the style, and I'm good to go. And now, of course, this benefits me a lot because it makes maintenance a lot easier. If I want to make a change to all of these menu items, I can simply make a change to the main component, and that change will be cascaded down to all the instances. Like, for example, maybe I want to change the spacing between icon and text to 8 pixels instead of 12, right? That's going to be automatically applied. Super cool. Now, there is another way of swapping an instance, and you can do that by right-clicking, right? So you select the instance that you want to swap, you right-click, and if the components are named properly, you'll have an option here that's called swap instance. But we'll talk about that in a future lesson. For now, let me show you another way of using instance swapping. So for that, you would go to the Assets panel. Yeah, you would open up the corresponding page here. You would select the component that you want to bring in. For example, this overview, or sorry, accounts should be here, right? That's the next on the list. So accounts has this stacking icon, which is, let's see if we can find it. It's this one here. Click and drag, hold down Control Alt, and just release it on top of the instance that you want to swap. And you can do that for a large number of items. So click again, Control Alt, and replace it just like that. And that's how instance swap works in Figma. And also remember that you can nest components, or should I say you can nest instances of a component. And I showed you that right here when we created this. So we had grid 2, which is an instance, and then we have the parent frame, which is a main component. And instance swapping works just as fine on instances that are not nested inside a different component, just like we saw in this example here. Now, let's take a look at a few key takeaways. In Figma, instance swap is the ability to replace one component instance with another. Instance swapping can be done from the inspector or from the Assets panel. Alternatively, if the components are using the same hierarchy, you can right-click and select Swap Instance. Components can be nested, and instance swap works on these just as well. So that's instance swapping and nesting. Now, as I mentioned previously, you can instance swap by right-clicking and selecting the option, but that only works in specific cases where the components are named accordingly. So let's see what that is all about. Let me start by saying that a design file should always be organized, and Figma gives us a lot of tools for that. One of these will automatically organize components if they are named a certain way. Let me show you. Let's assume that we're working on this sidebar component where we have a menu and each menu list has an icon attached to it. Now, when you are creating new menu items, as you saw in the previous lesson, you'll probably be using the swap instance functionality in Figma. Okay, so let's actually kind of duplicate this and let me ungroup it. And let's ungroup this again. So we just have access to the icons, right? So let's select all of these icons and let's create a bunch of components. Now, when you want to use one of these icons, you can go to the Assets panel or the Quick Insert, right? You'll have the full list of icons right here. But let's say you have other components apart from this in the same document. Well, Figma will basically show you a full list of all the components that you have with no way of organizing them. And sometimes it could be hard to locate the correct component. But watch what happens when we take a bunch of elements by selecting them and going right-click and rename. Let's see where that is. Oh, we actually need to go back here into layers and we can right-click here and rename, or we can press Control or Command R. Okay, so Figma recognizes that I selected 10 layers and it's going to say rename 10 layers. So what I can do is I can use the current name, but before that I can say icon or menu icon. Let's call it actually menu icon. And you can see a preview of what the new icon name will be. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the slash separated naming convention in Figma. So what you do is you do a slash, and I'm going to say rename. So now all of these icons are named menu icon slash settings, menu icon slash person, logo, card, and so on and so forth. So now when I go to the Assets panel and I open up my, my correct page here, you will see that these components are basically organized now under menu icon. And this becomes even more obvious when I open up the Quick Insert. And as you can see, we now have a category here that's called menu icon. So when I click this, I can see all of my menu icons. So that's a very neat way of organizing these. Now, also, if I'm going to do an instance of one of these elements, I can go in here in the inspector and I can do swap instance. And you can also see that my icons are now organized under menu icon, right? So I can choose whatever icon I want from here. Additionally, with this instance selected, I can right-click and I can now choose swap instance. And I can swap for any icon I want. Remember in a previous lesson, I was telling you that you can sometimes right-click an instance and choose swap instance. Well, that only works when there's a proper hierarchy to those components, right? And in this case, we do have a proper hierarchy because they are neatly organized under the name of menu or the category of menu icon, right? So that's the slash separated naming convention. But you can go one step further than that. Let's say that we have these icons, right? We have a bunch of monochrome icons in different sizes. So I have 32 by 32 and 16 by 16. So what I can do now is I can select all of these, okay? And I can create multiple components, or I can rename them first, Control R, and I can say icon slash monochrome slash 32 slash, and then the current icon name. So let's rename those. And then let me do the same for these, the 16 pixel variants. Control R to rename them. So icon, monochrome 16, and then slash again, current name of the file. Okay, so with those selected, let's create multiple components, and let's do the same here. And now, when I want to use one of these icons, they are organized in the following way. Monochrome icons. By the way, this is the name of the frame. So frames also help us organize components by using frame hierarchy, basically, right? So in the monochrome icons frame, I have all of these components. So when I go to quick insert, I choose monochrome icons, I choose the icon and then monochrome, and then the two sizes are now available to me. 32 by 32. And I can even take it one step further. See, now we have color icons, and I can do the same thing here. So I can select these and I can rename them, and I can say color slash 32 slash and then current name. So let's rename those. And I'll do the same here. Color slash 16 slash the current name. Notice that I didn't use the icon name anymore because we already have the name of the frame as color icons. So now let's create components, and for these. So now under quick insert, I have the color icons as 16 and as 32. But now notice that I don't have all of my icons like in a single category, because some of them are named using the icon slash convention and then monochrome, while others are named like this, color slash icon. So let's be consistent here and name them accordingly. So let's do the following. I'm going to use monochrome icons and color icons as my main categories, right? The frame names. So for the icons inside, let's select these. Let's rename them. And under match, let's do this icon slash monochrome slash 32 slash. Okay, so let's replace that with nothing, so we get the icons back to the name they previously had. So now we can name them properly. We can say monochrome icons, that's the main category, right? So we can simply rename them to 32 dash the current name. And let's do the same here. Control R. Here we can simply do this, rename, and let's do the same here. These are called color, or sorry, I should say this, color slash, and I'm going to do the same here, color slash. So now these are named 16 slash the name of the icon. These are named 32 slash the name of the icon. So now when I need one of these components, I can go to resources, lesson 5, and I have two big categories here, color icons, which have the two sizes I want. And then I have monochrome icons that also have the two sizes I want. So you can really play around with these as much as you like and rename them the way you see fit. This is just one way of doing it. But if you would rather have these icons in the same frame, let's say icons, you can grab these, paste them in, you can delete this, and then you can rename these the following way. So we'll have icons, which is the name of the frame, slash monochrome slash the current name of the icon. So let's rename those. Let's actually copy this. And then let's select all of these. Let's rename them as monochrome / the name of the icon. And then we'll do the same for these sets. This time, these will be color / current name. Okay, so now, because all of these icons are named monochrome /32 / the name of the icon and the 16 version, and then the color 32 and color 16 versions, when I go here, they're all going to be organized under icons. And then I can choose either color or monochrome, and then either the 16 or the 32 pixel version. So as I was saying, it's really up to you how you organize these, but Figma does give you the tools for that. And with that said, let's take a look at a few key takeaways. In Figma, the easiest way to organize components is by using frames. A much more powerful way of organizing is the /separated naming convention. This allows you to create as many levels and sublevels for component organization. For example, a component named button /large /full /icon will be placed in the categories of button, large, full, and icon. Use this system to separate components based on their style, function, or destination. You can rename components in bulk by using the rename function in Figma. And that's about it for naming and organizing components, a very useful feature. Now, so far, we've looked at some basic usage for Figma components. So what do you say we turn it up a notch and work on some more complex use cases? Let's start with component variants. To put it simply, variants allow you to group similar components in the same container. Let's take a button, for example, right? It can have different states, pressed, mouse over, disabled, and so on. Well, instead of creating a separate component for each of these states and have them scattered across your document, you can create a single component with multiple variants or versions, if you want, or variations for each of these states. Okay, so let me show you how you would create these variants. Let's consider the following scenario, right? We have these three elements. We have a hero section that features a button with an icon. And then we have a call to action section that features a similar button, but a little bit bigger and with no icon. And then we have a form which features, again, a similar button because it uses roughly the same color, the same fonts, but this time it's a pill button, or I should say a ghost button. It doesn't have a fill color. Instead, it has a border, and the text inside is colored, and it also has an icon. So instead of creating these three buttons as three separate components, we can create them as a component set, okay? And that component set will have variants. So here I have a copy of this button. Let's go ahead and turn it into a component. Now, with this still selected, let's go up here and choose Add Variant. So this will create a component set where we have the initial version and then a copy of that copy, which we can edit, modify to our liking. Now, a couple of things have happened here. We can see the button in the layers panel with its normal icon, but each variant has a different icon. So it's also a diamond shape, but it's filled with a solid color. And it's of course different from the instance icon we've been seeing so far, and also different from the main component icon. Also, in the inspector, we can see a new section called Properties, which defines a property name and property values. And these property values are actually the names of the two variants that we see here. So in terms of the property, we can say type. We can call this whatever we want, but we're essentially creating different types of button in this component set. Okay, and the first one, we can call it default with icon, and we can actually use spaces here. And the second one, when we rename it, make sure its name says type equals, or whatever the property name is. And the second one will say large without icon. And you can probably name these a little bit better. Okay, so now let's actually make this a second variant look like what we have here. So let's see, we have 48 and 32 in terms of padding. Let's do that. So 48 and 32, that's good. We have no icon, so we can simply delete that. And we also have a bigger font size here, right? We have 21 pixels with 30 pixel line height. And I'm actually missing a font here, but I'll simply replace it. So 21, 30, and let's make this bold, like so. And let's also update the font here. Let's actually keep this on medium, like so. Okay, so that's the second button variation. By the way, you can resize this however you want. And then we have a third variation here. So let's either select the component set and click on this plus sign, where it says add variant, or we can do it here in the toolbar, whatever works just fine. So let's actually click this, and that's going to create a copy of the original button. So with that done, let's take a look at this one and see what kind of properties it has. So 48, 24 for vertical and 16 spacing. Let's actually copy this icon. Let's paste that icon in. Let's make sure the auto layout properties are set correctly. So 48 there. Let's also remove the fill color, and let's copy the properties for this and paste them here. Now this is actually white, okay? And then let's copy the color for this and let's paste it here. And of course, let's also update the typeface there. All right, so now I have a component set with three variants or three versions of my button, right? We have the default with icon, we have the large without icon, and let's actually rename this to ghost with icon. Now, when it comes to using these buttons, we can do the following. We can, for example, select this bit. We can go to Quick Insert, Lesson 6, and then I can choose my button. Okay, so that's an instance of what we just created, and I can delete the old one. But now here's the interesting part. With this button selected, I can now go to the inspector and I can choose whatever variant I want. Do I want the large one or the ghost one? It's simple. I just select them from here. And then, of course, I can copy this instance and I can go in here and I can paste that in. I can select my variant and I can change the text here to whatever I want. And then I can do the same here, right? In the form, I can delete the old one. I can choose my variant. I can, of course, make this fill the container if I want to, and I can change the text, right? And this is all possible thanks to component variants. I have one component set that has three different versions. And then when it comes time to use that component, I can choose from whatever variants I have defined, which is pretty awesome. Now, in this demo that I just showed you, we actually created component variants from scratch, but you can also merge existing components as variants. So for example, in this demo, we have some form elements. We have a checkbox that has, first of all, a blue color or a green color, and then two states. We have checked or mixed. And then we also have radio buttons, right? We have a green radio button and a blue one, and both have two states, checked or unchecked. So right now, if I want to use either a checkbox or a radio button, it's actually pretty easy because they're organized under form elements, which is the name of the frame. And then because I'm using the slash separated naming convention, I can go into the various categories and choose the exact component that I want, right? But here's the thing, when you have like multiple levels and sub-levels, it can get tricky to find the component that you want. So what if we just had two components, one for the checkbox, one for the radio buttons? And here's how we do that. We select all of these components, and in the inspector, we can see an option, combine as variants. So let's click that. And let's do the same here, combine as variants. So now, for both of these sets, let's go ahead and define some properties. Blue and green, these are the values, right? Let's double click here and define this property as color. Property 2, let's rename it as state. And let's do the same here. Property 1, color. Property 2, state. So now, when it's time to use one of these components, I can open up either the quick insert or the assets panel, right? It works exactly the same way. And under form elements, I just have two components, checkbox and a radio. So now, let me actually put a frame behind these so you can see them better. So now when I select the checkbox, for example, I can choose between different variants like this. Do I want the green color? Okay. Do I want the mixed state? I can do that. Or maybe I want the blue color instead. Everything is nicely laid out for me here in the inspector, where I have access to the property names, color and state, and also the different values for those properties. And the same goes for the checkbox, right? I can select the instance and I can choose green or blue. And because the state just has two values, I can actually use this toggle switch, and Figma does this automatically for me, which is pretty awesome. So that's how you can use component variants to your advantage. In cases like this, where the slash separated naming convention just isn't enough, or it might actually create more problems than solve, then using variants is a really good option. You would just add your variants with the different variations of the component, and then Figma will allow you to choose the different ones in a very efficient way, I would say. So yeah, that's the second option. If you already have components created and named, you can select them and combine them as variants of a single component. Okay, now let's have a look at a few key takeaways. Figma variants allows you to group similar components in the same container. In other words, have variations of a component in the same place. Component variants are part of a component set, and you can have as many variants as you want. Variants will declutter your Figma document because instead of having variations as separate components, they are grouped into a single component set. Variants can be created from scratch or by combining existing components into a set. All right, and those are component variants. Now, let's move on and talk about probably one of the most powerful features in Figma. And this was actually introduced in 2022, so it's relatively new. I've already talked about it in this lesson. It's called component properties, and let's explore that in more detail in the next lesson. As we saw previously, component variants can be very powerful. However, there is a certain threshold where using them becomes inefficient. And that's when you have too many of them, okay? So let's assume that your document, or you have a component with 200 variants, okay? You have a button with various states, various colors, light and dark mode. It can happen, right? You can reach a very high number of variants. Well, when that happens, it's going to be pretty hard to find the right variant, even if you organize those variants properly. Now, to solve this, Figma came up with something called component properties, and these are not a substitute for variants. Instead, they work alongside them to simplify the whole design process. So let me show you how to use them. Before we start, you need to know that there are 4 types of component properties. We have instance swap, text, boolean, and variant. Let me start with the easiest one, which is text properties. So let's take this button and turn it into a component. And let's duplicate this, and let me grab the original and place it somewhere outside. Now, let's assume that I want to change the content of this button. I wanted to say something else. Well, the way we used to do it was we selected the text inside and we would change it to whatever we wanted. But with component properties, we can do that a lot easier. So what we do is we go to the main component and we select the text inside there. And in the inspector, where it says content, we can see a little button here that says create text property. So let's create that. We can name it whatever you want. In my case, I'm going to leave it at text. And the value, we can also specify a default value. So let's name this button text, create property. So now this changed the default text inside my button, my main component. But then when I select the instance, in the inspector, I have a property here that's called text, or whatever name we just gave it. And I can actually rename this right here in the inspector without having to select that text again. Of course, I can do it the old-fashioned way, but this is a lot better. So that's one component property. That's the text property. What about Boolean properties? Well, Boolean properties refer to states like on, off, visible, invisible, and so on. So for example, let's say I want to create a version of this button with no icon. So I can go in here in the main component and I can select the icon, and in the inspector where it says layer, we can see another create component property button. This time it says create Boolean property. So let's click this and we're going to name it show icon. And this can be either true or false. And by default, I want it to show the icon. So let's create the property. But then when I select the instance, I have another available option here in the inspector that says show icon. And of course, when I check or uncheck this, the icon becomes visible or invisible. Pretty awesome. So that's Boolean property. Now let's have a look at instance swap. And for that, we're going to go right here where we have these elements, right? These are exactly the same, or not exactly the same, but they're 90% the same thing, right? We have a component that has an icon, title, shorthand notation, a number, and then another number here. The difference between these is, of course, all the text content is different from one instance to the other. The icon is different. And also, we have another major difference here. The color of the text. One is with plus and it's green. The other is with minus and it's red. So let's see how we can create this section by using components and component properties. So what I'm going to do is actually, first of all, select the section in its entirety. And then I'm going to select the other icons. So let's grab it from there. Let's paste it here. Let's do the same here. And let's do the same here. So now I have these three icons. And let's create multiple components of them. And let's also rename them to crypto icon / the current name. So they're organized a bit better. Now let's grab a copy of this and paste it right here. So we'll basically replace this standalone one. And then we'll take this and we'll create a component. So now inside this component, let's select this instance of the icon. And right here in the inspector, we're going to click Create Instance Swap Property. And I'm going to call this crypto icon, or I can just call it icon. It really makes no difference. So now I can actually select the default. I'm going to leave it at Bitcoin. And I'm going to create the property. And then I can select this and I can create a text property. We're going to call this title. Select this, do the same. Create property. Let's call this shorthand. Select this, create another property. And by the way, you can actually use existing properties and the contents will basically be overwritten. So let's create this as, I don't know, price. And let's create this as trend. Okay. So now let's copy this component and let's go in here and let's paste it in. Let's remove the old static content. And now let's duplicate it. And in the inspector, we can see a lot of properties. So I can change the icon. It was what? Ethereum. I can change the title. I can change the shorthand like so. I can change the price for, I don't know, whatever it was. And I can change the trend to a new value. And that's the power of component properties. But we still have an issue here. We have some properties like this trend that can be positive or negative, like we have here. So what do we do then? Well, it's quite simple. We select the main component, we add a variant, okay, and that variant would be, we'll call negative for value, and the property is going to be trend type. And here we'll just copy the properties from here. We're going to paste them here. And we're also going to change the sign. So now, if I'm going to duplicate this once again, I can select the trend type. We have the default, which we can actually rename to positive. And then I can go in here and I can select the negative trend. And then I can do all the other changes that I want. I can say minus 1.5%, like so. And I can, of course, change all the other properties. just like I did previously. Now this, what I just showed you, is called a variant property. And I actually showed these to you in the previous lesson, but now you can see them in a different context. So to sum it up, we have 4 component properties, right? We have text properties, which allow us to change text. We have Boolean properties, which allow us to switch the visibility of an element on and off. We have instance swap properties, which allow us to do instance swapping from the inspector. And then we have variant properties, which allow us to switch between different variants. So let me actually move this over. We can switch between the different variants, which is pretty cool. Now, there are, of course, other use cases for all of these component properties. So, for example, I could use them on these buttons. Here, I just set 2 of them for the text and the icon, but I can create a variation or variant of this button to accommodate the ghost type, right? That's going to be another property, variant property. I can create an instance swap property for this icon, right? Because we have one icon here, but we have a different icon here. So you can use these in a lot of different applications, and it's super powerful because instead of creating a bunch of variations for this list item, right? I can just have 2 variations and then a bunch of properties. I really like this this feature in Figma. And also, before we wrap up this lesson, you should know that these properties can be reordered and edited even after they were created. So if I were to select this component set, I can go in the inspector and I can double click any of the property names and change those. And I can also click and drag to reorder these in any way that I want. So maybe I want the title to be first. I can just drag this up, and Figma actually will place the variant properties at the very top. Let's say I want the icon to be second and shorthand, or actually shorthand second, icon third. So now when I select any of these instances, you'll see that these properties are now properly reordered in the inspector as well. Right then, so a few key takeaways for this lesson. Having too many component variants can be inefficient. They become hard to manage. Component properties are a better way of managing large amounts of component variations. There are 4 types of component properties: instance swap, text, Boolean, and variant. By using the inspector, component properties can be edited and reordered even after they were created. Right then, we're almost at the end of this course, but there's just one last thing I want to show you, and that is interactive components for prototyping. That's coming up next. Prototyping is all about interaction, right? Its purpose is to show you how a design would work in the real world. So how a user gets from point A to point B, or how that user interacts with various elements. Now, to make this interaction as close as possible to the real product, Figma allows us to create interactive components that allow us to switch between different variants in a prototype. Let me show you some examples. So let's start with some of these form elements here. I have basically a checkbox that has 2 colors and 2 states. Okay, so I can select all of these, and I can create multiple components, and I can also do the same here. And then I can take all of these and combine all of them as variants. So now I just have one component set. Now, to create an interactive component, I need to select it and then go to the prototype tab. And then I just need to create an interaction. So for example, I want an interaction going from the default state to the checked state whenever I click. Okay, so I'm going to select on click, change to property green, and then checked. And I didn't go through naming these component properties. They're just called property 1 and property 2, but you can name them whatever you want. And you can also choose the animation here. Either you want instant, dissolve, smart animate. I'm gonna choose instant. And then I can also do the exact opposite. I can click on the unchecked, and that's gonna take me to the default state. Okay, so now when I create a new frame and I use this radio button, I can open up the presentation, and let me actually zoom in here a little bit. And then you'll see that when I click, this changes states. It changes from one variant to the other. So that's pretty cool. What else can we do with this? Well, let's consider this, this button, right? Let's create or select these three states. We have default, hover, and press. And we can go in here and we can create a component set, which will add these three as variants. And we can just call them state. And this is default. This will rename to hover. And this will rename to press. So with the component set selected, we can go into prototype. And we can say, okay, let's add an interaction from this to this. And it's going to be while hovering. And let's actually change the animation to smart animate. And we can choose an easing. We can play around with the different options here. For me, let's just stick with the defaults. And then hover, I'm going to go to press, and I'm going to say on or while pressing, change to state press, also with smart animate. And then I can go from the third to the first. I can select mouse up, for example. It's going to go back to the default. So now, if we're going to create an instance of this button, and let's put it inside a frame, and let's open up the prototype. Let's actually fill the screen here. You'll see that when I hover, that changes to button hover. Of course, the button will have the same text in my case. But then when I press, it changes to button press. And when I release, it goes back to the default. Of course, here, actually, when I release, it should go back to hover instead of the default. Okay, so let's actually run this again. And now you'll see that when I press and release, it gets me back to hover. So that's pretty amazing. And one final example, we have these tabs here, right? So we basically want to have a variant where the active tab is on the right side. Okay, so what we can do is we can create a duplicate of that, move this around, and then I just need to swap out the colors. Let's go back to the design tab. So that's that color, 50%, and this will simply be white, 100%. Okay, so with these two selected, let's create a component set. And with the set selected, let's go to prototype. And let's select this element, create an interaction. that goes here, and I'm going to say on click, we're going to change to this variant with Smart Animate. And then when I click on this, it's going to take me to this variant, exactly the same properties. So then, if I'm going to use this component in a page, like so, and we create a prototype, we're going to be able to see exactly how this works. Notice when I click here or here, it's going to create a nice animation. And that's a simple way of adding animation to buttons, menus, and a whole lot more in a prototype by using interactive components. Now, some final key takeaways. Figma lets us create interactive components that give us the option to switch between different variants in a prototype. To get started, select the component set, open the prototype tab, and create interactions between variants, just like you would on any other prototype. Interactive components represent a great way of animating buttons, menus, and a whole lot more in a prototype. All right, folks, and that's about it for Figma components. I hope you enjoyed this course. Let us know down in the comments if you have any questions and how you plan on using Figma components in your design projects. Don't forget to also check out the Envato Tuts Plus YouTube channel for more content like this, and also hit that subscribe button, and why not give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Thanks for watching. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.